Welcome back to another episode of the Taiwanology podcast. This is your host, Liu Guangying from Taipei. If you follow the Paris Olympics this summer, you might recall Taiwan competing as Chinese Taipei, making an impressive showing with 2 gold and 5 bronze medals. But perhaps not a lot of people know who brought home Taiwan's very first Olympic medal. In 1960, at the Rome Olympics in Italy, C.K. Yang, better known as Yang Chuanguang in Taiwan, claimed silver in the Decathlon, finishing just behind Rafer Johnson of the United States. You might expect these 2 athletes to have been fierce rivals. In fact, they were close friends, even training side by side under the same coach in the lead up to the games. Their relationship is not only a tale of competition, but of camaraderie. And it holds an emotional depth that we'll explore further in the show. Today, we're thrilled to have 2 special guests with us in the studio. First is Mike Chinoy. He's an expert on East Asian politics and foreign policy. He has a storied career as a foreign correspondent for CNN, where he served as the network's first bureau chief in Beijing, and later on as senior Asia correspondent in Hong Kong. He's also the recipient of Emmy, DuPont, and Peabody Awards for his journalism. So welcome to the show, Mike.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay. And we also have another guest joining us. He's a good friend of mine. His name is James Liu. He's the founder of Joint Pictures Company, 嘉映电影公司, a film production house based in Taipei. Welcome to the show, James.
It's my pleasure.
I'll have to thank James for arranging the interview with the director, Oliver Stone, for his documentary on nuclear power a few months ago. So that was really my pleasure. We're here to talk about a very special project that these gentlemen co-produced. It's a documentary film called Decathlon, the C.K. Yang and Rafer Johnson story, which recently aired on Taiwan Plus, the TV station, and is available on YouTube. So first of all, for people who are not familiar with you guys, could you say something about yourself? And Mike, you are a very veteran China correspondent and who has lived in Taiwan in the past few years. So tell us about yourself.
Well, I was a foreign correspondent for over 30 years, working for CBS News and NBC News, and then almost 25 years working for CNN, covering the news all around Asia, plus Europe and the Middle East and Africa. Since leaving CNN, I've been affiliated with the University of Southern California, although I've just now moved to the 21st Century China Center at the University California in San Diego. So I specialize in sort of East Asia, Northeast Asian politics, geopolitics.
Right. So are you a researcher or do you teach as well?
At the moment, I mostly do research and write books and do documentary films.
Right. And you've been living on and off in Taiwan since a few years ago, right?
I lived in Taipei from 2002 to 2006 when I was still working for CNN. And I moved back here in early 2022, primarily to work on this Decathlon project.
Oh, okay. I see. So this is like the result of this 2-year-long project. Okay.
Right.
And James, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I studied journalism in Taiwan, but I didn't work as a journalist.
Smart.
But I think, it's still a heavy influence from my education in the journalism school. I'm a distributor, also a producer. So, documentary become something very, very interesting to me. I think that's the reason, because the training from journalism school. So we pay more attention to what's going on around us. So, yeah, basically I'm a producer and also distributor. Distributor means that we imported foreign films, including documentary films, and we release here in the theater in Taiwan, and also in streaming on DVD.
Right. Yeah. I think the films that are produced and distributed by joint films there are some really great documentaries. We were just talking about. There's a documentary about the Falun Gong activists called Changchun, and also the nuclear energy film by Oliver Stone. And there are really a lot of other really wonderful and also critical documentaries that you have introduced to us.
Yeah, since I cannot report about it, so I brought film to share with us, the audience, and we can discuss.
Right, yeah. So you're actually still doing the job of a journalist.
In a way, I find now.
Yeah, so really appreciate that. And so, Mike, you are a correspondent on China issues, writing about China, and you were in Hong Kong a lot. What made you interested in this story about sports and decathlon?
Well, I got involved in this. I'd left Hong Kong and left CNN. I was living in Los Angeles when the co-creator of this project, John Critch, who had been a correspondent for the Asian Wall Street Journal, he was working on an article about famous Asian Olympic athletes in the run-up to the Beijing Games. And he had a kind of vague childhood memory of C.K.
So that was
Yang.
2008.
2007, 2008.
Right.
And so John came here in 2006, and he tracked C.K. Yang down. He didn't even know if he was still alive, but he found him, and they hit it off, and they spent a lot of time together. And John did his article, but he also videotaped 4 or 5 hours of interviews with C.K. And then C.K. sadly died the following year. And John and I go back a long ways. And so we would sort of brainstorm, we've got this wonderful material, what can we do with it? And the story of C.K. and Rafer is a very compelling one because it involves both one of the most epic battles in the history of sports and the history of the Olympics, their battle in the decathlon at the 1960 Games in Rome, and an extraordinarily inspiring friendship at the same time. And so we thought this is a wonderful story, and how could we tell it? So I got to know, living in L.A., Rafer Johnson, who was living there.
And when was that, when you met
2009, 10, 11, 12.
Oh, wow, okay.
And C.K. Young's widow, Daisy. And John and I tried all sorts of different avenues, tried to explore how best to make this project come alive. But making a film is hard and complicated, and there were all sorts of obstacles and roadblocks. And so it just took a very long time. And it wasn't until 2019 when we connected with our director, Frank W. Chen Wei-yang. He had done a wonderful film, which is still on Netflix, about Wang Jianming, the famous Taiwanese baseball player who was a big star player for the New York Yankees until his career was cut short by injuries. And he did this wonderful film called Late Life. So we contacted him and asked if he would be interested in working with us. And he immediately got the impact and potential power of the Rafer and CK story. So we started working with him, and then he brought James in on the project, and then COVID happened.
Oh, okay.
And so that slowed everything down. But it was a kind of blessing in disguise because it changed the time frame in such a way that we were able in the end to get it finished and bring it out during the Paris Olympics, which was a very fortuitous timing. So it premiered in the second week of the Olympics, when everybody's talking and thinking about the Olympic Games.
So it was actually a project 14 years in the making. Because when you and John Critch first had the idea, it was 2007, 2008.
Something like that.
Right. Yeah. And 14 years later, actually 16, 4 Olympic Games later, we see the result. So, James, let me ask you, why did you agree to produce this film?
Actually, I first met the project in Taipei Golden Horse project pitching event.
Okay, 金马.
Yeah, 金马创投会.
Right.
And I was surprised because I immediately recognized Mike.
Okay, so Mike was there at the pitch.
Because he was a CNN correspondent.
Right.
I was a regular, audience.
But at the
to
time,
watch.
Frank Chen, the director, was already a part of the project.
Yes. They are all ready.
So maybe 2019 or something.
It was 2019 because COVID screwed everything up after that.
Right, I see. So this is the Golden Horse pitch before COVID happened.
Yeah, before.
Okay, right,
Yeah.
2019.
So because Mike immediately attracted me to this project, because I know his background, even I don't know him, but I know he's a veteran about Asian, issue, not just like a foreigner come here to tell us
The parachute.
Yeah, that's right. So I had a meeting with them, and then later we have a discussion how we can push this through. So we were lucky, and we get some support locally, and we can start develop the project and try to film something. And that's how we started. But it's still a long road. We still need to raise more money to complete the film, especially for the license fee for those archive footage from IOC. And that later became a big problem for us to overcome. But we figured out a way to move on with this project. Yeah, originally, when I first learned about this project, it was a feature-length documentary. But we ended up finishing a TV version.
Uh-huh. So what was your original idea? Ideally, how would you produce this film, a feature-length documentary?
I was curious about, first, like why a bunch of Americans want to do this film.
About Yang Chuanguang.
About Yang Chuanguang. But later I find out actually they spend more time about this subject than most of people, everyone I know in Taiwan. Nobody pay attention to this person anymore. Just like in the documentary, the well-known athlete Ji Zhen.
Right.
She said, people just forgot about him.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist here anymore. But he was part of our history, right? So I think it's just something we need to do. Is like the whole team feels that the same reason behind it to push us to make this project happen, even as we know it's very difficult.
Right. So this is like a forgotten piece of
Yeah.
Taiwan history
Yes.
that is being rediscovered and picked up. So for those of you who haven't watched the film, you could go on YouTube and search Decathlon, the C.K. Young and Rafer Johnson story. Right. Yes, I was going to say legend, but story. Right. So if you watch the film, you will be really impressed of the wonderful animation that was included in the story. So why did you use so much animation?
I think that's when you confront a situation that you can find a better solution.
What was the situation you're talking about?
I just mentioned about IOC, the license fee to require. It's a very long legal process to get those rights right. Because if we're using those footage, we need to pay a high license fee.
How high?
It's tens and tens of thousands of dollars. The IOC is famous.
Wow.
The IOC and FIFA are the two organizations that are most notorious for being extremely demanding in terms of what they ask people. And you talk to many other documentary filmmakers who want to make films with Olympic themes. They all say this is a big problem. So we had to devise a way to illustrate the events, and what we did was a montage of still photos, which is what in the end a lot of people end up having to use. And that's why you see often in documentary films still photos rather than videos of certain events, and it's simply because the video is prohibitively expensive.
I see.
And in our case, we were able to combine that with this wonderful animation.
Right, yeah.
Which I think evokes a kind of emotional response and is visually, in some respects, even more powerful than the original footage.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the animation was really well done.
Yeah, you're talking about the animation because when we stuck by this IOC license fee, and then it happened, I released a film, Eternal Spring, Changchun, the documentary film about Falun Gong, and the film was animated by Guo Jingxiong, Da Xiong. So I had a talk with Frank, the director. Maybe we can think about using animation if we can convince this guy to work with us.
Right.
Because I have the contact from this Eternal Spring. So I talked to Da Xiong, and he responded very positively almost right away. He said, James, this is a perfect subject because it's sports. Sports works with animation. Animation shows those angles and the movements very easily. But for film, you cannot have those angles. It's too difficult to catch it on film.
Right.
But with animation, you have that flexibility.
Right.
So Frank, he's also, I think it's very interesting. Our director, Frank, he also have an architectural background. So with that kind of training plus animation, they click very quickly. So they have a conversation about which part need to be animated, because we don't have all the money to do the whole film with animation. That's going to be very costly as well. So they decide they will have, like, originally it was 4. I think we end up like 8, right? 8 parts, animation sections. And with Frank's the style of brevity, I should say, from his architect, that's just my explanation. So these two things worked perfectly. And when we present it in the film, you can feel the quality, the production value is very, very high.
Yeah.
And actually, we don't have that much money to spend. So
the other thing about the animation, it wasn't simply a question of footage that was prohibitively expensive. There were elements in the story for which there were no pictures of C.K. Young's childhood and Rafer Johnson's childhood, but where we had them talking about interesting things that happened. C.K. Young, for example, tells this wonderful story about how his mother first realized that he was a fast runner when, during the Second World War, he watched an American plane being shot down by the Japanese, and he ran and ran and ran through the rice paddies as a kid, just excited to see this. And then he ran into the Japanese soldiers. He turned around and ran back as fast as he could. And his mother said, "I didn't know you could run so fast." It's a wonderful tale. And we have him saying this, but nobody was taking pictures of him. So we have it's animated. And the same thing with other moments in the story for which there are no pictures. And this is a kind of a new sort of developing trend in documentary filmmaking of using animation to cover places where you don't have still photos or video. I mean, and the Eternal Spring, Changchun, is one example, but there are others. So this is increasingly common kind of technique that people who are doing films are using.
And also effective. I think animation actually elevates the film, makes it much better. So an interesting question from Mike, because you're into sports. For those of us who are not very familiar with sports, could you explain what a decathlon is? What does it involve?
The decathlon is generally considered the hardest event in sports. It's 10 events over 2 days, 5 events per day. It involves running, it involves jumping, it involves throwing. It involves using all different parts of your body. So you can't just be good at one thing and win the decathlon. And generally, over the years, the feeling has been that whoever wins the gold medal in the decathlon at the Olympics merits the title of the world's greatest athlete.
Right.
Because you could be a good runner, but you can't throw, or you can't leap, or you can't do the pole vault or the high jump. So it's an extremely difficult event in which you have to be good at everything.
Right.
And so the battle that C.K. Young and Rafer Johnson fought in 1960 at the Rome Olympics was really for the title of who would be considered the world's greatest athlete. And so Rafer ended up winning gold and C.K. ended up winning silver. So you could say they were the first and second greatest athletes in the world at that time.
Right, but the difference was actually pretty slim, right? So it was a really heated race.
It went down to the last few seconds of the last event, and that was really the first time, and I think it may still even be the only time in the Olympics where a decathlon wasn't decided until the last couple of seconds of the last event.
So in terms of TV, if you were a TV producer, this is like the best kind of event that you could broadcast, I think.
Extremely tense and dramatic.
Yeah, can't even script it. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what the story means for Taiwan and the U.S. Welcome back to Taiwanology. This is your host, Liu Guangying. We have in our studio today the co-producers of the documentary film, Decathlon, the C.K. Young and Rafer Johnson story. We were just talking about what Decathlon was and how difficult it was to produce, to make this film. And we used a lot of animation. So, Mike, I have a question about Rafer Johnson. So, as a Taiwanese and who didn't start following the Olympic Games not for too long, I have to admit that I didn't really know about Rafer Johnson before watching the film. Maybe when I was very young, I have heard the name Changshen, maybe. But growing up, we didn't know a lot about Rafer Johnson. So how well known is he and how is he received in the U.S.?
I think Rafer Johnson was a very well-known figure. Of course, he passed away a few years ago, so the memories are fading. And one of the reasons we made this film is for both of these men who have now passed away, we want to introduce their story to a new generation of audience who I think will find it interesting. But Rafer was a very important figure, both as an athlete and as a political symbol. And in fact, one of the interesting themes in the film is that both Rafer and CK were among the very first athletes who were also important political symbols in their times. Rafer became prominent during the early days of the civil rights movement in the United States.
And he was African American.
And he was African American. And so he was seen as a symbol of African American achievement at a time when Black people in the States were struggling for basic civil rights. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He won all sorts of awards. And he became the first African American to carry the American flag at an opening ceremony of the Olympic Games, which just incidentally was an honor that was given to LeBron James at the Paris Olympics. So you can see LeBron is sort of coming in Rafer's footsteps. As an athlete, he was obviously the gold medal winner and a really great athlete. But he became, as I say, an important figure in the fight for civil rights. And then he was also very close friends with Senator Robert Kennedy, the brother of President John Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy tragically was assassinated in 1968. And when he was shot and killed, Rafer was next to him. And it was Rafer who actually tackled the assassin and took the gun away. And this plunged Rafer into a very deep depression, which he talks about in the film. And he only emerged from that when Kennedy's sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, started the Special Olympics. And Rafer was the first famous athlete to lend his name and reputation to the Special Olympics. And for the last 40 years of his life, he became known as a kind of great humanitarian and as somebody who, there are all these pictures of Rafer with these kids, who have disabilities of all sorts. And that's what he devoted his energy to. So he's famous for his athletic achievements. He's famous as an important figure and a symbol of civil rights and African American advancement in the States, and also as an advocate for the disabled in the Special Olympics. So he was a kind of towering figure, and at the end of his life, UCLA, where he and CK both trained together, named their track after him.
Oh, okay.
And we have video in the film of that. And so he was kind of showered with honors, and when he died, it was all over the television news, and there were big obituaries in the newspapers. I must say, having known him, he was a wonderful guy. He was absolutely didn't have an ego.
You've met him?
I got to know him reasonably well in L.A. about a dozen years ago. He was not like your typical athlete of today. He wasn't somebody who had a big ego. He was interested in other people. He was the exact opposite of today's pampered, self-centered athletes. And that's part of the attraction, is that both of these guys were not like the superstars of today, even though they were among the first athletic superstars and the first athletic superstars who were also political symbols.
But they were humble and they liked to hang out with regular people,
exactly.
common people. So yeah, it sounds like Rafer Johnson was really what you said, towering figure. So if you ask Americans now to name like 10 famous athletes that they have known, like Olympic athletes, they will probably name Rafer Johnson as one of them.
Probably. I saw a plaque at the LA Coliseum, which is the famous stadium in LA where the 1984 Olympics were held, which incidentally was where Rafer had the honor of lighting the Olympic flame. And it listed the 100 greatest athletes of the 20th century, and Rafer, in all sports, and Rafer was in that list.
Right, yeah. So that's Rafer Johnson. And so James, how about CK Yang Chuanguang? How is he received and remembered in Taiwan?
First of all, personally, I really think CK is a very mysterious person. Even after producing this documentary, I still can't see the real as an audience, honestly. Who is really the CK Yang?
Yeah.
My one question is like, how can you befriend a closest friend as your competitor and you lose the most important game in your life to that person and you still be friends with him like brothers?
You cannot imagine. If you were him, you cannot do that. Okay.
I don't think even in the family, right, between brothers, you still very difficult. Even you know maybe your elder brother is smarter than you and stronger than you, but you still. And also there's another thing. I was born in 1960, the gang year. And I always remember when I was young through those patriotic kind of education, propaganda, from the KMT. And I always remember Yang Chuanguang is the tragic hero. He's supposed to be the winner. And he led because he liked Johnson so much. So he would rather, just let him to win.
So that was the story told to everyone.
I don't remember who told me the story, but I don't think I was dreaming. But somebody I learned, that's how we see this. Actually, that's one of the reasons I like to get involved in this project. We have no answer because we don't have a chance to ask CK or Rafer Johnson about what's really going on, about 1,500 meters run, 1,500公尺, because that's one big event that CK had advantage. But on that day, he didn't run fast enough because as long as he had run fast, maybe 2 seconds or 3 seconds,
and he would have won.
Yes.
Maybe he just got tired.
I don't know. I just get that impression. He
did it deliberately.
Like we always say, 孔融让梨嘛. Like we give it to our
very Confucius,
the elder brothers. Yes, but that's how I see this event. Maybe that's one reason, since he didn't want to go, and also all the political changes over the years now. So people tend to not talk about him anymore. It's just you don't know how to comment about this person. We also show that in the documentary. You can find out because he switched his political party for election. So he's a very, very, I say, use the word mysterious, like how he made those decisions. Because he died in the U.S. From a Taiwanese point of view, why you choose maybe your wife, your family, they were in the States?
Oh, so they emigrated to the U.S. Later on.
His wife was Chinese American.
Right.
And her family was from the greater Los Angeles area. So he sort of moved back and forth over the years. Yeah. I would just say, in the course of the film, there's no evidence to back up the argument that he let Rafer win. This is simply,
I don't think that
this is simply a case where the way the decathlon works, it's very interesting. It's not simply who wins each event, who does better, but there's a points system. So, you get a certain number of points for throwing the javelin 50 meters. And if the other guy throws it 45, you get a certain number of points. But if you throw it 65 as opposed to 55, you get more points. So the final totals are like 2,000 points, 3,000,
9,000 points.
And basically to win gold, CK would have had to win the final event, which was the 1,500 meter run, by 8 to 10 seconds. But Johnson kept up, and so he won the race, but he only won it by 2 or 3 seconds, so not quite enough. But one of the things that there's a quote that Rafer Johnson has that's in the film where he says, "As good as I felt about winning, I felt bad that my best friend had lost. And as bad as he felt about losing, he felt glad that his best friend had won." And to me, that quote encapsulates the spirit of their relationship and their friendship, which I find, again, in this day and age, particularly inspiring. And it's partly because of that kind of sentiment that I stuck with the project for so many years, trying to bring it to life.
Yeah, so there was just so much camaraderie between these men. It's almost like if one wins, both of them win. They win together, actually, in my opinion. Right. But then another unanswered question is, how come Rafer Johnson was so still revered and remembered so well in the U.S., but CK is kind of forgotten? Well, of course, he didn't win gold.
He's not the only one actually in Taiwan now in the past maybe 20, 30 years.
Right. Sports people were not really.
I think it's just because the political atmosphere changed. So.
What do you mean by that?
Finally, we have a after a long process of looking for like a more democratic society, so we have more freedom, we make changes. So many things they tied up with the KMT from the past, becoming like they will just treat it as a propaganda. This not really is something that we be proud of it in a way.
I didn't know that CK was perceived as associated with KMT.
I think originally he represented KMT.
Oh, because he got into politics.
Right, he got into politics.
I
Sorry, I didn't say it clearly. Mainly the politics, he choosing. So even in the documentary film, also there's people comments about
saying that he shouldn't
maybe it's
have
not the right field for him to get in,
But also, when he won silver, it was a huge deal for Taiwan because not only was it the first time anyone from Taiwan had won an Olympic medal, he was the first person with a Chinese surname ever to win an Olympic medal. And when he came back, there were parades, and he was greeted by Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And that's what I mean is he became this political symbol of Taiwan and in its battle with China and as a symbol of the regime. And he himself was completely apolitical. He wasn't interested in politics. He was a kind of whimsical, witty, fun-loving guy who was thrust into this political role, which he was not comfortable with. But it just came with the circumstances. But I think partly because he's a product of that old period, and then because he had a kind of unhappy stint as a KMT legislator, and then he broke with the KMT and joined the DPP, and he didn't get reelected. And so there isn't a political constituency to do him any favors. And it was a very long time ago, so it's like, who cares? That's ancient history, which is too bad because he's a attractive and important historic figure, and we try to make that point in the film.
Yeah, so it's when I was doing research for this interview that I know that he won the very first Olympic medal for Taiwan, and nobody really knows about that, talks about that these days. I think really that career in politics was maybe not very favorable for him. So people primarily remembered him as a failed politician, maybe. So that was why. But then I think what's interesting was CK Young became a national hero at the time for winning that medal. But he didn't really get into advocacy for indigenous people like Rafer Johnson did for African Americans in the U.S. And so this is a segue into my next question, which is about politics. Some people might say identity politics. How important was that element in your film?
Well, CK was an indigenous person. He was an Amis. But of course, back in the 50s and 60s, the identity of indigenous people was suppressed. And so he wasn't particularly he was aware he was Amis, but he wasn't an Amis activist. And that generation, there weren't Amis activists in the same sort of way. So it didn't become as central a part of his identity as, somebody who's a Amis athlete.
So that was probably not even talked about at the time.
Not very much. It wasn't a big deal for him, whereas race in the States was a hugely controversial issue and remains a hugely controversial issue. And I think one interesting point is that the political issues that shaped these two men were the Taiwan-China conflict and sort of the fight for racial equality and social justice. And if you fast forward 60 plus years to today and you look in the news, what's in the headlines? Taiwan-China tensions, and especially in the States, fight for racial equality and social justice. And so that makes their experiences decades ago relevant in a way that might not otherwise be, and therefore makes the film relevant.
Yeah, we're still seeing the same tension around us still. So that's really makes the film really timely as well. Right. And another question, because I know that you have done a few screenings in Taiwan, around Taiwan maybe. Can you share with us some interesting feedback you get from the audience?
Okay. I'd like to share one thing. We went to the National Training Center in Zhuoying to film when John was here.
The Center for Training Athletes.
Yeah, National Training Center. That's where CK was the head coach for the national team. His assistant back then, Linda, she actually was the person hosted us when we were there. I was a little bit worried about her reaction. When we finished the film, I sent a clip to her, and she sent back right away her response. It's like she cannot see clear. She was crying, means by that whole thing. After so many years, she see CK again because she was his assistant for many years, very close to him, also to the family. So she also sent a message to CK's wife and got a response from her as well. So that's something I was very touched because it's from the family. It's not from just like general audience. They really have a strong tie, so they must scrutinize the film, and because they were there. So when they say they are touched, I mean they're really touched by the film.
Yeah,
so that's something make us feel very, very,
right,
good.
And how about the audience? I think it's very important that the family of these athletes think highly of the film, but do other audience feel, how do they feel about the film?
The reaction has been uniformly positive. People really like the film. It's a revelation to many people. It's a story that they either have never heard of or vaguely know the name, but had no idea what the story behind the name was. It's interesting, James says that CK's longtime assistant, Linda, was crying when she watched the film, because I've had a number of people tell me the same thing, that especially by the end of the film, they had tears in their eyes. We did a big public screening here at the Eslit Cinema, and people said they were crying at the end. I got emails from friends who streamed it on YouTube who said I was crying at the end, and others who have just said, thank you so much for telling a story that needed to be told. If you go on the YouTube channel and there's space for comments afterwards, and it's fascinating to read the comments because people are, I would say, deeply moved and very glad that the film was made and learned something that they didn't know much, if anything, about. So it's been overall overwhelmingly positive.
So what do you expect the audience to take away from the film? So for people who didn't know about CK Young and Rafer Johnson?
I think fundamentally it's a film about the enduring power of friendship that transcend. Here you have two people from the opposite sides of the world who under normal circumstances would never have even met. Mm-hmm. And yet they not only met, and they met under circumstances where they were intense sports rivals, yet they forged a friendship that lasted a lifetime. And it, I think, is just a film about the power of friendship and how friendship helps people confront all the challenges and difficulties that we all face in our lives. And it's a way of helping you get through it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good message. And I suggest that everyone, if you haven't seen the film, go to YouTube and search for Decathlon, C.K. Young and Rafer Johnson story. And maybe leave comments on a YouTube page. Right. And also let us know that if you cried watching the film. I think the producers will be very interested to know. So thank you, Mike and James, for coming into the studio. This was a very interesting conversation. Also, I learned a lot. I feel like I need to watch the film again. So thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That wraps up today's episode. If you enjoyed this podcast, please take a moment to leave a review or shoot us an email. To read more about Taiwan's participation in the Olympics and the controversy, please visit Commonwealth English website. Our next episode will be available January 14th. This show is produced and edited by Yayuan Zhang and Weiru Wang. I'm your host, Liu Guangying. Follow Taiwanology wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time.